One of our wise ones from Wednesday Bible study, Sean, shared some wisdom this past week from his father, who is a United Church minister. Sean says that his dad says that there are two kinds of people. The first kind is the kind of person who believes that Easter Sunday comes after Good Friday, that death of the cross is overcome by the life of the resurrection. Tears flow into joy, loss is overcome by love, endings are the start of new beginnings. Easter comes after Good Friday. And the second kind of person is the kind of person who believes and acts that Good Friday comes after Palm Sunday, full stop. Good Friday comes after Palm Sunday. Yes, there are celebrations and jubilations, but the terminus of every parade is ultimately death. Resurrection is beyond imagination. The story stops at the cross, and reality is primarily defined by the base impulses that got us there. Cynicism, scapegoating, brutality, mob mentality. The result being a nihilistic fear of nothingness that says we may as well divide up the Savior's robes and get while the getting's good. So the question is, where does Good Friday fit? After Palm Sunday, before Easter morning? It's not a trick question. It's a worldview question. It's a how then shall we live question. And as our gospel text today shows, it's a much more challenging question than we might initially think. Mark's resurrection narrative is by far the most challenging one in the four gospels. If you pick up a Bible, some translations of Mark continue past chapter 16, verse 8, where we read to today, to include appearance stories. The resurrected Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, and then to two disciples, and then to all the disciples when he gives them a commission to go and share the good news. But almost all scholars believe that these appearances were added afterwards because our ancestors found Mark's original ending so unsatisfying. So the women, Mark says, went out in chapter 16, verse 8, and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Despite the promise of resurrection and the evidence of the empty tomb, the story ends with a fear-filled flight, and with implications that can't be fully appreciated without understanding the wider narrative. You see, the great preacher and teacher Craddock notes, this is the last of a series of rejections that Jesus had suffered. First, he is rejected by the religious experts who might have been expected to recognize him. Then he is rejected by his family, his own flesh and blood, and then his hometown neighbors, and then the crowds in Jerusalem, and then he is fatally rejected by his friends and followers. One betrays him for money, the leader of the bunch denies any association with him, and ultimately they all desert him. On Good Friday, Jesus is utterly alone. There is no repentant thief as in Luke's narrative, and Jesus' only word is a cry that God too has seemingly abandoned him. Is anyone left? The reader is left to wonder. And then as the sun rises on the third day, the women appear in the story. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome. Here is hope that the story of Christ will go on. But as Mark narrates, they have come to the tomb to complete a funeral, not to celebrate the resurrection. They flee as well. The final rejection. With great literary skill, Mark demonstrates just how difficult it is to live in the light of resurrection. Most people, even the disciples of Jesus, even the ones who receive the good news from the mouth of angels, are still in Good Friday. They are the second kind of people. Mark, therefore, ends his gospel with a challenge. Everyone else has abandoned Jesus. Now, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? This is not an academic question. It is a worldview question. It is a how then shall we live question. Because we are undoubtedly, in a Good Friday moment right now. The pandemic might be mostly over, but the new great sickness plaguing the land is the lack of hope. It is a weariness, an existential dissatisfaction with how we are living and how we are treating each other and the planet. I think many of us feel helpless in the face of the monumental issues of our days, such as deepening income inequality, the backsliding on human rights and attitudes towards LGBTQ communities, the growing despair about climate change and its far-reaching implications, especially on the poor of the world, and those whose identity and spirituality are particularly connected with the land, such as indigenous peoples. And when we feel helpless, it is all too easy to fall into the get while the getting's good attitude and just try to carve out a bit of comfort and security for ourselves and the ones we love. But when we look into our hearts and God's law written there, those universal truths marked, printed, carved, engraved, or otherwise delineated within the essence of our being by the loving hand of our Creator, we see, we feel, we just know how unsatisfying a Good Friday existence is. The tomb is no place for us to live. We are suffocating. We need to get out of there. And we need help to roll away the stone that's blocking us from living as God intends. But here's where the heartbreak lives. The places where traditionally people would go to get help, to get out of a tombed existence. The places where for millennia people would go to renew hope and to get connected with the deeper mysteries of life are in their own existential crises. The moderator of the United Church of Canada, the Right Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation in BC, put out her Easter message to the church on YouTube this past week, and it starts out, I've been thinking a lot about the nature of life and work in the church. Specifically, I've been thinking about the bad news story of churches being in decline, with the United Church leading in that trend in Canada. The financial sustainability of the church is in question. The number of volunteers is dwindling. The church feels like it might be in crisis to some. The church definitely feels in crisis to others. Recently, when asked about church decline by Broadview magazine, Michael Blair, the General Secretary of the United Church, pondered that the revelations of unmarked graves at former church-run residential schools has affected public behavior and attitudes towards church, all church. And despite the soulful, respectful, and transparent work of reconciliation the United Church has done and is doing, Michael's words ring true for me. In the season of Lent, I ran a gathering on the joys and challenges of parenting while Christian, and I heard how some young parents, and maybe this rings true for you as well, fear judgment from others and feel the need to be closeted about their faith in social and work circles, specifically because of the church's harmful past actions towards Indigenous people, and how some current expressions of Christianity hold bigoted attitudes towards the LGBTQ community. We are in a moment in human history when many of us feel helpless about the monumental challenges we face, while at the same time, many of the places that traditionally have helped people move through these times are also feeling helpless in the face of monumental challenges and are struggling to find hope in the future. It sure sounds like a Good Friday moment to me. And if this is true, then we have a choice to make. Does Good Friday come after Palm Sunday, or does it come before Easter morning? With great literary skill, Mark demonstrates just how difficult it is to live in the light of resurrection. Everyone has abandoned Jesus, the religious leaders, his family, his neighbors, the crowds, his disciples, and finally the women at the tomb flee in fear. Throughout the entirety of his gospel, Mark has allowed us, the reader, to be an invisible presence in every scene. If you have joined us for worship here these past months when we have been reading from Mark's gospel, we have borne witness to everything. We stood on the shores of the Jordan and heard the heavenly voice declaring Jesus to be God's child. We watched him exorcise demons and perform miracles. We journeyed with him in his time of trial in the desert and into the holy city, shouting, "Hosanna," with the crowds. When his disciples couldn't keep their eyes open, we stayed awake with him in the Garden of Gethsemane. When Jesus cried out on the cross and breathed his last, we were there. We were there. And today, alongside the women at the empty tomb, we heard the angelic instructions to go and tell of the resurrection. We have been there, a silent, invisible presence in every scene, the witness to every event. We have watched the abandonment by every single person in Jesus' life. And then at the very end, in the abrupt and completely unsatisfying ending, Mark makes his big move. He breaks the fourth wall, the camera pans away from the cast of characters and focuses right in on us, you and me. We are now the active agents. We are the ones given the power to finish the story. Everyone else is still living in Good Friday. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to live with fear and trembling, simply scraping out an existence until you die? Or are you going to live in the light of resurrection, with hope and a love so brilliant that the forces of death are forced to turn away in shame? Which kind of person are you going to be? It is a question so fundamental. This is where Mark leaves us. To answer for ourselves, But of course, we know that fear and trembling is not the end of the story. We may not have the words on paper, but we know that those brave women overcame their fear. Otherwise, the story of Jesus would have died in the tomb. If they did not choose to live with Easter hope, we would know nothing of resurrection. Therefore, we would have nothing to celebrate this morning. Resurrection is a promise so profound, it needs to sink in. It takes time and prayer and a community of support to fully embrace. And in this Good Friday moment, God knows we need resurrection. Resurrection is God's antidote to death in all of its faces. Crucifixion, yes, but also bigotry, also spiritual colonialism, and racism, and misogyny, and anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, and greed in its many faces. In these times of incivility, war, and climate change, Easter proclaims that the shroud of death no longer controls us, that the future is open and we are free to act boldly and lovingly in respectful relationship with each other and the earth. Easter is the final fulfillment of love. And does that not sound like good news? Does that not sound like something we would want to choose for ourselves, for our children and grandchildren, and the seventh generation down the line? I asked the wise ones in Bible study this past week what they needed to hear this Easter. And more than one of them wanted to hear about hope. How despite evidence to the contrary, there is a living, ringing hope for our species and our planet and for our country and our church. In fact, they wanted to hear how the church can be a beacon of hope. How we here in places like this can choose to reflect God's light into this beautiful, aching world. To do this will take humility and the courage to admit our fears and our failures. It will take a public, intentional, and explicit effort to remedy wrongs and to lay new cornerstones, especially with the LGBTQ and indigenous communities of this land, so that together Together, all people of spirit may build the kind of future where love is the default. To live an Easter life means believing and speaking and acting so that love is not the exception, but the default. The air we breathe and the bedrock under our feet. None of us is meant to live in a tomb. We are meant to dance and sing and let the trumpets ring the good news that Christ is risen. Indeed, on this most wondrous of days, we are here to proclaim that God's liberating love has turned rejection into embrace, brokenness into wholeness, despair into hope. And like those brave women so long ago, we too can be daring messengers of hope. Through us, the church can be a beacon of hope. Whenever we choose to be the kind of people who move through Good Friday moments with the strength and the faith to know that Easter morning does come. Go and tell. Go and tell God's promises are true. Go and tell that life is stronger than death. Endings are the start of new beginnings, and the final fulfillment is love. Alleluia, alleluia, hallelujah. Happy Easter to you.